Today is Palm Sunday in Christianity, and this is the beginning of what is called Holy Week. Holy Week is arguably the most solemn time in Christianity, but it ends with the most glorious time. Holy Week begins with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. That's Palm Sunday. On Thursday, Jesus is grabbed by the Jews. Friday, he is crucified and buried. And Sunday, he rises again. Today is Palm Sunday. Thursday is what is called Maundy Thursday. The word Maundy means commandment. There are different interpretations of why that is called Maundy Thursday. One says that it goes back to where Jesus said, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another." And there are two ways in Christianity that historically that has been seen played out on Maundy Thursday. One of them is foot washing. The Gospel of John, does not have Jesus instituting a meal of communion or Lord's Supper or whatever. Instead, it has the foot washing. And so that is tradition in some churches on Maundy Thursday. Another tradition in some churches illustrating love one another is to give to the poor. And so that's Maundy Thursday. Then, of course, Good Friday is the day Jesus was crucified, and then Easter, he rises. So today is Palm Sunday. It is when we commemorate Jesus entering Jerusalem during the last week of his first time on earth. The Gospels report that Jesus had traveled around Galilee for about 3 years prior to this. He was healing people and teaching. Now, Galilee is somewhat north of Jerusalem, and where we see most of the activity in the Gospels is Galilee. Jesus decided at some point to go to Jerusalem. Exactly why, we do not know. But he went there, and when he got there, a large crowd of people came out to meet him. Now, Jesus was very popular with people, and before this, we are told, as Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem, that every time he comes into a town, a huge crowd comes out. They hear he's coming, and they come out to greet him. And the same thing happened when he got to Jerusalem. A whole crowd of people came out to greet him. It's called Palm Sunday because in one of the gospel accounts, it said that people came out waving palm branches. In the one that we heard from Luke this morning, they came and put their cloaks on the ground. So it's a good celebration. Palm Sunday, Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but there's a lot more to it than that. Remember that although Jesus was very popular with the people, the Jewish leaders did not like him. They hated him. He had been in conflict with Jewish leaders since the beginning of his ministry, and when he got to Jerusalem, it only intensified and it reached the boiling point. And so he enters on Sunday, and he gets killed on Friday. Jesus is killed by crucifixion, and we are told that was a fairly common method of killing people back in that day. It involved hanging someone on some kind of frame, and there were different styles of those frames. The one we normally associate with is this kind of cross back here. But the historians tell us they used all kinds of different frames. The person to be crucified was usually severely beaten, and then they were hung up there and left there till they died. Now, from historical sources, we do not know how long it took people to die. Opinions vary. If you look at medical sources, a lot of people will say like 6 to 9 hours. And then other people say, well, it could take till the next day. But either way, it was a slow and painful death. Now, crucifixion was often used back then after a military conquest or after some kind of revolt in order to strike fear into people so they would be subdued people. It was also used as a method of capital punishment for criminals. It was a very cruel way to kill people. Jesus came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday riding on a donkey. You often see this portrayed in art as Jesus riding on a very small donkey, but that's an interpretation. Donkeys can be large. I've seen them almost as big as horses. In fact, we are told that in the ancient world in Damascus, which is not all that far from Jerusalem, it's often talked about in the Bible. An industry had grown up in the ancient world where they bred large riding donkeys. So there's no way to know how big this donkey was. It just says that it was young and no one had ever ridden it. So Jesus comes riding in on that donkey and a large crowd comes out. Everybody was talking about it. We see Jesus taking a whip, going to the area of the temple and driving the money changers out. And we hear then that infuriated the Jewish leaders and they wanted to kill him, but they were afraid to touch him because the people liked him so much. Then after Jesus gets to Jerusalem, we see blind people and lame people coming, and Jesus heals them. He spends a few days teaching around Jerusalem, and everybody loved him. The conflict with the Jewish leaders, though, intensifies. They follow Jesus around, trying to get him to say something that they can use to get the Romans to kill him. And Jesus did not take this nicely. He criticized them right back. So they were desperate. They knew they couldn't do anything because everybody loved Jesus. So they made a deal with one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot. They gave Judas money, and he would let them know sometime they could get Jesus, but nobody would know it. And that's what happened. Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane praying, and the Jewish leaders came and got him. One of the disciples, we are told, took out a sword, cut off somebody's ear, but Jesus healed the ear and told him to put the sword back. The disciples all ran off, and the Jewish leaders took Jesus to the high priest. Now, a lot of times you will hear this referred to as the arrest of Jesus. Technically, it was not an arrest. These were not the Romans doing this. It was the Jews. They just kidnapped him, grabbed him. Peter, one of the disciples, follows from a distance. He blends in with the group of people at the courtyard of the home of the chief priest. And 3 people tell him, I recognize you as one of Jesus' disciples, and he denies it. He denies it 3 times. Jesus is taken before the Jewish leaders. They beat him. They mock him. They try to get witnesses to come forward and testify something they can take to the Romans to get him killed, but a bunch of people come in lying and the testimonies don't agree. They can't really get anything to use. And during all this, Jesus remains silent. He doesn't say anything. And finally, the high priest was exasperated, and he said, tell us who you are. Tell us if you are the Son of God. And Jesus responded, I am. Now, I am is the name that God gives himself in the Old Testament. And I am is what Jesus said. When the Jews came to get Jesus out of the Garden of Gethsemane. They say, we're looking for Jesus. And Jesus said, I am. And he says that one of them fell backwards. So I am is the name for God. And that's what Jesus says. I am. The high priest was furious at this. He's calling himself God. And all the Jewish leaders agree he's guilty of blasphemy and deserving of death. And so they blindfold Jesus. They spit on him. They beat him. And they mock him. As soon as it gets morning, they take him to Pilate. Pilate was the Roman official in charge of that area. They tell Pilate Jesus is claiming to be a king. You need to get rid of him. He's stirring things up. Get rid of him. Pilate tried to question Jesus, but just as Jesus had done with the high priest, he stayed silent. Pilate, though, knew what was going on. He knew the Jews had brought Jesus there because he was so popular and because they were jealous. And they wanted to get rid of him. But Pilate also knew something else. That it wasn't just because they were jealous that they wanted to get rid of him. Jesus was saying things that were directly in opposition to their religion. And they believed he was an enemy of God. So Pilate didn't want anything to do with this. And his wife sent word to him, don't get involved in this. I had a dream last night about this man. Don't get involved. So Pilate had heard the Jewish leaders say that Jesus was from Galilee. And Pilate realized, well, I'm not in charge of Galilee. Herod is in charge of Galilee. And it just so happened that Herod was in Jerusalem at that time. So Pilate thought, well, I'll just send him to Herod and get rid of the problem. Now Herod had heard of Jesus and was interested to meet him. So Herod was glad when Pilate sent Jesus to him. And he tried to question Jesus, but Jesus wouldn't answer him either. The Jewish leaders repeated the same accusations to Herod. Herod and the soldiers made fun of Jesus and treated him with contempt. They dressed him as in a beautiful robe and said, "Hail the king," and all that. Herod decided, though, that he didn't want any part of it either. So he sent Jesus back to Pilate. Now Pilate tries to find another way out of this. He remembered that it was coming up on the time of the Jewish Passover, and it was a custom then that the Roman governor would release one prisoner at that time. So Pilate thought, well, I'll just release Jesus. But by this time a crowd had gathered. We aren't told why the crowd gathered or who it consisted of. We're only told there was a crowd. There were more people now than just a handful of Jewish leaders. But the Jewish leaders worked with the crowd and stirred them up against Jesus. So when Pilate asked, "Who do you want me to release?" they said, "Barabbas," who we're told was a robber. So Pilate said, "What do you want me to do with Jesus? I don't find any fault with him." The Jewish leaders stirred up the crowd, and the crowd yelled, "Crucify him." Pilate said, "What? What has he done?" The Jewish leaders kept stirring up the crowd, "Crucify him, crucify him." And the crowd was evidently large and boisterous enough so that Pilate was fearful what might happen if he didn't do what they wanted. So he said, "I'm washing my hands." He washed his hands in water. And he said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. You see to it." And the crowd answered, yes, let his blood be on us and on our children. And so Pilate released Jesus to them to be crucified. The soldiers put a purple robe on Jesus and made fun of him. They put a crown of thorns on him. They beat him. Then they took the purple robe off, put his own clothes back on, and let him out to be crucified. We are told that Jesus was crucified at a place called Calvary, also known as Golgotha. No one knows where that was. It was assumed to be outside the city of Jerusalem proper, though. And we are told there was a large crowd following along as Jesus was led out to be crucified. According to one gospel account, the soldiers got a band from Libya, a man named Simon, to carry Jesus' cross. According to another gospel, though, this gospel insists that Jesus carried his own cross. But among the crowd of people following along, there was a group of women who were crying. And Jesus said, don't cry for me. Cry for yourselves. And cry for your own children. Because the day is coming when women with no children would be considered the lucky ones. The day was coming when people would be begging the mountains to fall on them and the hills to hide them. Jesus was crucified between two others who we are told were robbers. Pilate had a sign put up on top of the cross that said, "The King of the Jews." The Jews went to Pilate and said, change that sign to say, he said he was the King of the Jews. But Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. The soldiers divided up Jesus' clothes. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh to drink, but he refused it. That would have been sort of like a sedative. And as Jesus is hanging on the cross, the Jewish leaders come by and they laugh at him. And they make fun of him. Come down from off that cross if you can. The soldiers made fun of him too. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now we are told that Jesus' mother Mary was standing near the cross. And Jesus turned to his mother and he pointed out one of the disciples and he said to her, he is your son. And to that disciple he said, she is your mother. And from that point on we are told that that disciple took care of Mary. As all three of Jesus and the two thieves were hanging on their crosses, one of them was making fun of Jesus and taunting him. If you're who you say you are, save us all. The other one, though, said, hush. We are crucified because we did wrong, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he turned to Jesus and he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus said, today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus said, I am thirsty. The sponge was soaked in vinegar and put on a stick and thrust up for him to drink. Jesus said, it is finished. It is accomplished and done. Now we are told that Jesus died at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was put on the cross at about 9 in the morning, so he was on the cross for about 6 hours. At about noon, that would be in the middle of that time, it said that the sun stopped shining. The whole country was covered in darkness. And everything stayed dark until Jesus died at 3 o'clock. And we're also told that when Jesus died, the veil in the temple was torn in two. So what was the veil in the temple? We're not sure. In the Old Testament, when we first hear about the tabernacle, which was a tent that they used to house the Ark of the Covenant before they had a temple. And then back when they had the temple, the Ark of the Covenant was kept in a place in there, and there was a veil there. Only the high priest was allowed to go in there, and he could only go in there once a year. It was said that if anyone else tried to go in there, they would be struck dead. You see, the idea was in ancient Hebrew religion that God actually resided in there. That's where God was. That's actually the meaning of the word temple. It's a house where a God lives. So back when the Hebrews had the tent with the Ark of the Covenant in it, in a place separated off with a curtain or a veil. And then when they built the temple and made a room and put the Ark of the Covenant in there and put a veil in front of that, a curtain there, they believed God actually was in there. That's where God was. By New Testament times, though, the temple that they had in the Old Testament was no longer there. They had built other temples, a succession of other temples afterwards. And we have no idea what that temple of Jesus' day looked like. There was no Ark of the Covenant back then. That drops out of the picture at the Babylonian captivity and is never mentioned again. And so nobody really knows what that veil in the temple was for, or what it signified. And so for that reason, it's impossible for us to know with certainty what the ripping of that veil signified. At 3 o'clock, when Jesus died, we are told that the whole earth shook, rocks split apart, and it said that many people who had died were raised from death, and they went into Jerusalem, where they were seen by many other people. Now, Jesus was crucified on Friday. The next day would have been a Sabbath day for the Jews. And the Jews wanted the bodies took down before their Sabbath, so they asked that the legs of the men on the cross be broken to be sure they were dead. When they come up to break Jesus' legs, they saw he was already dead. But one of them drew his sword and stabbed at Jesus in the side, and it said a mixture of blood and water drained out. A man named Joseph of Arimathea, who was a follower of Jesus, came and asked Pilate for the body. Now we are told that he had kept it secret that he was a follower of Jesus because he was afraid of the Jews. So he wrapped the body in a linen cloth, put it in a tomb that he had recently had hewn out. A man named Nicodemus, the guy who came to Jesus by night, and Jesus said, "You must be born again." Another secret follower of Jesus helped Joseph place this body in a tomb. And they sealed the tomb with a large stone. So the Jewish leaders were sitting around and they remembered how Jesus had said that if he were killed, he'd rise from the dead. So they said, you know, some of his followers are going to go steal that body and claim that he rose from the dead. So they go to Pilate and they say, you know, they're going to cause a lot of trouble. They're going to claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Why don't you put a guard on the tomb? So Pilate did that, placed a guard on the tomb. Now, this was Friday afternoon. On Sunday, Jesus had entered Jerusalem and large crowds had come out to greet him in the space of just these 5 days. Jesus' conflict with the Jews had come to an end. He had been killed and was buried. The Jews won. They rejoiced. Yet another victory for us. Yes, we have won. We have won. We have won. It's important to realize, though, that these people did not intend to do anything bad. They were not consciously trying to do evil. They believed in their heart they were doing good. They truly believed that Jesus was against God. After all, they believed that they were the only people in the whole world that God cared anything about. That God virtually hated every person in the world except them. We're the only people in the world God cares about. We're the only people in the world who know about God. We're the only people in the world who know the truth. We are God's people. Yes. Everybody else is nothing to God. But here comes Jesus. He's criticizing them. He's telling them they don't know God. He's saying, you don't know God. It doesn't matter that you claim you're children of Abraham. It doesn't matter that you keep your little laws. You don't know God. So what would you have thought? You know, if somebody would come in here today and start telling us that Christianity was 100% wrong and everything we believed about God was wrong, how would you respond to that? Would you take that well? So, you know, a lot of times we tend to demonize the Jewish leaders, but we shouldn't do that. These people thought they were doing right. You just think for a minute, if somebody came in here and said, everything you believe about God's wrong. There is no Jesus. That's everything you believe about Jesus is the line, all this, that, and the other. How would you think about them? Now you can understand why the Jewish leaders felt about Jesus the way they did. They said, you've got a demon inside you. You're evil. You're from the devil. And they truly believed that. We have got to try to put ourselves in the position of those people and not demonize them because they thought they were doing good. And when they killed Jesus, they really believed they were eliminating an enemy of God. When they killed Jesus, they really believed they were doing God's work. These people were not trying to be evil. They were trying to do good. They were trying to defend God and their people. So Jesus was not crucified by people who were trying to do bad. Jesus was crucified by people who were trying to do what they felt was right. The most heinous evils in the world are committed not by people who are trying to do evil, but by people who truly believe they are on God's side and doing God's work. And they truly believe that the people they act against